Hello, Lavecon. Okay, so hopefully we've had a good time in managing some of those screenshots. Got to see a few people, which has been great. Again, I really do hope that eventually we end up with people being able to smile. I mean, how can you take postcard photographs or tell people where you've been on your holiday if you can't smile while you're at Lave Station? I mean, that's all these tourists who are being carted around the universe on beluga tours and what have you. They need to be able to smile more. Clearly that's a feature that we need to work on. Anyhow, so this panel, the next hour, is devoted to games writing experiences. Now, I've got a great setup of people here who are much more knowledgeable than I am, but I'll try and contribute where I can too, in terms of what we're looking at. So joining us for this particular panel are, and in no particular order, only in the order that they suddenly appear on my screen, the estimable Chris Jarvis, who has just giggled, bless him.
Hello.
And he's still looking somewhat shadowy today, but I'm sure that's not a sinister thing at all. Chris has some experiences in relation to to working with board games, working with all sorts of different physical games, and I'm sure he's going to share some of those experiences with us. We have John Stabler. Hi, John. Oh, is the camera working? Is it not working, John? He's unmuted, but well, anyway, John should be joining us. John obviously makes games, so his projects with things like Spin Duel and some of the other small games that he's made and premiered at Lavecon. I'm hoping he'll be able to talk a little bit about some of those instances. And also joining us, welcoming him back from a little bit of time away, we've not seen him for a while, is the wonderful Darren Gray. Hi, Darren.
Hello, everyone.
Hooray! There he is. There's somebody who knows how to deal with the sunlight and a light source. Chris, you could learn so much. So Darren hopefully can talk a little bit about his experiences with working in the games industry and working on writing. And also joining us as a new guest for Lave Radio and Lavecon this year is Emily Inkpen. Hello, Emily.
Hello.
So Emily works in the games industry, works on a variety of different products. I'm sure she's going to be talking a little bit about that, and she'll give you a little bit of an idea about what she does. And she also writes. She writes audio, so you'll be seeing her tomorrow for the Writing Audio Experiences panel as well. And you'll also be seeing her this evening in the author readings, which is all queued up and ready to go, so long as Grant can push the right buttons, which I'm sure he can. Okay, so that's our panel for the next hour. We're gonna talk a little bit about some of the aspects of games writing, some of our experiences. We're coming at this from slightly different directions, so I think that's good, and hopefully should give us a bit of a healthy kind of take on different stuff. And who knows, we may even talk a little bit about some of the narrative and writing ideas around Elite and some of the things to do with it. So I'm going to go to the first question in relation to this, and I'm going to ask this to be open, so whoever wants to dive in first, let me know that they want to dive in first, and so we'll do that. Sorry, I'm hesitating because suddenly something popped up. There we go. I have the window on my screen suddenly changed. There we go. So I'm asking this openly to our panel. What were your first and formative experiences getting behind the curtain with games, and how did those experiences shape your thinking about them? Who wants to start off?
I mean, I can go back really early to, I guess, the ZX Spectrum days, because when I first learned to code and I learned a little bit of BASIC, I'd say the first and most obvious thing for me to try writing was a text adventure. So in a sense, my sort of earliest experiments with coding and game design and that sort of thing were very text-based experiences. Particularly since I didn't really have the programming skill to create these kind of graphical, these full screen graphical things. So just, even though there were elements where I did use graphics, I was very much inspired, I think, by things like, the Hobbit game, and the Very Big Cave Adventure and all that sort of thing. So that's always, I find text adventures really interesting because they are an explicitly kind of written and narrated exploration of a space, and you're trying to do it in such a way that allows the player to interact with the text and discover it sort of at their own pace, which I think is, for me, I think is a key element of games writing, is not to kind of overwrite it or to try and lead people by the nose, but actually to try and create a narrative, whether that's with words or with whatever kind of narrative you're constructing in the story, and actually having things in that sort of narrative that gives the player an idea of where they need to go next and what they need to look at next, without necessarily a big thing that says go this way kind of thing.
Okay, anybody else?
I could go?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so basically, I came at it as a writer, and as a writer, like, there's not too many sort of like, it's not like being a developer where a step into gaming is really, really obvious. Like when you're coming at it as a writer, normally people don't talk about writers in games at all, and I felt like, so I came across a couple of panels that were being held at BAFTA. And I went and I listened to those, and it was mostly narrative designers, and they were being really open and honest about their experiences, which were not necessarily brilliant. But I worked in tech, and I understood that because there are certain similarities between like tech companies and gaming development companies specifically. And so seeing that actually in tech, it's working in tech essentially, and there are problems across the board, and I was like, okay, yeah, this is cool, but it is still my area. I can write in this, and that was really exciting. And yeah, I mean, like, just seeing behind the scenes, seeing that there are writers working in that space, writing creatively, writing longer form, but then also, I mean, once I joined the gaming company, the thing that I didn't expect was how creative it was, because until I joined the gaming industry, I was working in healthcare, and it was not creative. And that's the only thing that I wasn't really prepared for. All of the dysfunctionality and the craziness and the crunching and all of that stuff. I mean, like minor crunching, but all of that was pretty expected. But yeah, just working in this incredibly creative space with people who are all fundamentally creative, that is still taking some getting used to, because I've always been a square peg in a round hole. And yeah, now I'm like everyone's like me, and it's so disorientating.
Darren, what are your thoughts?
In terms of formative experience, I guess my most memorable is when I first wrote for someone else's game, because I'd made lots of games myself. But Tales of Magial, I got involved in the development of it, but then the developer decided that they wanted to redo the entire setting. He'd made it based on Tolkien initially, but he decided he wants to commercialize his product. So that everything Tolkien out the window. So had to write a whole new setting from scratch. It was very exciting, very fun. What was really interesting to me is that the player base, some of them lapped up every bit of lore you could throw at them. They would read through hundreds of pages of stuff and enjoy every little tidbit and analyze it, and it would affect how they chatted about the game. They'd start role playing around it. That was fantastic. And some people didn't care at all. Yeah. They're like, why is this text in the way? Just tell me where to go. That's it. Don't faddle about. So it was an important sort of lesson. And I mean, where I really ran into struggles actually is that I wasn't that interested in writing really standard elves killing orcs kind of stuff, right? So when I started introducing things that made the player put in a sort of more moral quandary position, some players really had a very negative reaction to that. So interesting experiences. But yeah, writing for someone else's stuff is, in a way, it's good. You've got someone that's at least going to say no to things, right? So
Yeah.
you're not your own editor, which is a useful thing to have. But it also meant that there's certain boundaries you can't push to quite the same extent as you'd like.
I think for me, it's I mean, there were certain things I can kind of cue off of what Chris said, really, in that you know, that moment of trying to actually code stuff and try. You know, I've always been a person who sort of likes the nuts and bolts and tries to figure out what the nuts and bolts are, but I can't program. And I know that, you know, that other people can do that, you know, really, really well in terms of what they're up to. But I had Perseus and Andromeda, which was a text-based game for the Commodore 16+4, and you do what some people do when they get in those kind of text-based games, get frustrated, and so you start trying stuff, and then you start swear words, and so, you know, the interesting thing there is you start the swear words, and you know, somebody had thought about it. You know, they'd thought about it and made sure there was a stock phrase in return. So you typed in your swear word and they went, "May the gods strike out your tongue," you know, and you're like, oh, I got a different response, you know. So clearly somebody had thought about what you know, what a player would do. And I tried to program. I got as far as being able to make my computer print a square and some text underneath it to say the door opens, you know, and that was it, you know, as far as I could get. So, you know, I kind of gave up at that point. And then, of course, later you have the experiences of being able to work with companies who are, you know, who are doing it. And suddenly you find that they, you know, that behind the scenes, they actually need somebody to make some content. And that was eye-opening. You know, very eye-opening, and every company's different. To pick up on what Emily was saying, just this, you know, the narrative designer role. I mean, I was very fortunate to listen to Rihanna Pratchett talk about narrative designers and how they work and explain the difference between them and writers. And every company I've spent any time doing any writing for, they're all different in terms of how they value writing. And they're all different in terms of when they bring the writer in. You know, the writer gets either to be there formatively, helping with the narrative, or later on, we need a scene. Can you just write some dialogue? You know, it all different in terms of what's there. So yeah, I think that those are kind of it's kind of strange. Now, I don't know if John's joining us. I've not been able to raise him so far. So, John, are you there?
Hello.
Hooray! There he is. Right, he has managed to join us. John, we're talking through formative experiences in relation to writing for games. So, or writing games experiences. So, first and formative experiences behind the curtain.
I suppose it's back when I first started learning to program, back in the days of the ZX Spectrum. I started out with text adventures. And one of the big problems back then was, you know, the game was very much designed not with like a narrative in mind. For instance, I remember entering this code listing to create an adventure game. And one of the solutions to the problems were to take some batteries and a Hoover that you picked up and put them together to suck up a ghost. Okay. Now, that for me, there's nothing logical about that because I don't know of many Hoovers, well, up until recently, that use batteries. You had to plug them in. So, and that kind of thinking hadn't been set up in some sort of way beforehand or anything like that. So, that was my first experience of it. And it took me several years to actually come to that realization because obviously I was only 9 at the time. And I suppose when you're typing out the code listing and you can kind of see that coming, you're like going, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But looking back at it now, I was like, that's terrible game design. And that's terrible writing.
Rigel's Revenge had you know, it would take like 30 minutes to load on the Amstrad. And you then it would say, you're in a room and it's all dark. And you're like, okay, what do I do? And apparently what you were supposed to do is pick up torch.
Naturally, yes.
Oh,
Yeah. No one said there was a torch. The amount of times I loaded that went off for a cup of tea, came back and went, right, okay, I'm gonna crack this time. What am I supposed to do? Oh, pick up torch. Apparently that's what you're supposed to do. Who knew? But yeah, I mean that kind of, I think there are probably many kind of examples of where these things just don't join up, do they? Or at least they, somebody, it obviously joined up in one person's head, but they didn't necessarily join up in the audience's head or the player's head in terms of what's there.
Yeah. I think that's like one of the things about that Darren was saying about being your own editor as well, because if you've got other people who are reading this, you can kind of watch that and user test it a little bit at least.
Did anybody make that mistake? Has it not for Rigel's Revenge? Anybody written anything where they really didn't think? I know, Chris, you with audio have always got a great piece of advice about invisible characters, which I expect we'll probably touch on.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you want to say? Yeah, I mean, my view, obviously audio drama being, not an entirely spoken medium, but primarily a spoken medium. But there's this, the idea that I have in the script that obviously, if a person doesn't speak in a scene, they're not there.
Yeah.
You can't ask your audience to assume that someone's there if they don't have any dialogue. And I had it, I mentioned earlier that I'm working on somebody else's audio drama, and they're obviously very new, coming to it and haven't necessarily learned what things to avoid. And I was editing away, and then suddenly this character pipes up, and this was, a good couple of minutes into the scene. And I was like, I had no idea this person was there.
Yeah. It transfers with different mediums, doesn't it? Because of course, if you're in a text-based adventure, it's probably the same. If they don't talk, then they're not part of what you're doing. I actually have. There is a book that shall remain nameless, but I've used as examples in teaching, where, and Karen, if she's listening, will probably start laughing downstairs, where there is a dog throughout this book that appears and disappears. And at one point, in one particular chapter, which I used to use as an example with students, the writer wrote it in such a way as that his friend, the main character, and then he turns to his friend, or rather his friend is, he's mentioned who his friend is. And he turns to his friend, or turns around and then describes his friend as panting. And you realize that he's actually talking about the dog, not his friend, and you're like, his panting friend, this is very strange. So obviously, people's logic definitely needs sense checking. So Darren's entirely right. We all need a good editor in any medium, I think, and this definitely goes to prove it that there are these jarring moments. So how do you approach your writing for or about games? Which aspect are you involved in, and what's your starting point? So given that John came in last, let's start with John.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I am prepared. This is actually one that's quite difficult for me because, I've only just recently really got into writing for games. And I suppose this is actually something where I'm probably more likely to learn than to give advice, because I enjoy writing multiplayer games, which aren't famous for having great narratives, because it's kind of hard to squeeze it in when, people just want to get in and shoot each other. But the recent game, the one that's part of this weekend's competition, Spin Duel, I actually had to write a narrative, which was very new for me, because, and I kind of realized this with Elite Dangerous, the original Elite, as Alan will attest to, he's talked about this multiple times, is it created this world. There was this kind of verisimilitude to the world, even though you weren't been spoon-fed a narrative and you made the narrative yourself. And what we found out with Elite now is people expect more story to be given to you. if you know what I mean. Everyone's just saying, well, you know, this game's a bit boring, there's not much to do. And I'm like going, well, it's just the same as the old Elite in that way. But I think people were hoping for something more epic and to be, I don't know, for something to be created for them and to be made part of that. So I've now come to the realization I need to write more or get a writer involved in making my games. So yeah, I'm going to pass that one back to you, I'm afraid, Alan.
No, that's okay. I mean, I was assuming that you were gonna talk a little about the writing of the code and the other bits and pieces to do with that. To be fair, as well. So that's entirely fair. I mean, I know from the little pieces that you've produced over the years. Multiplayer is basically where is a big thing of what you do with the different things that you've produced. We remember while we were waiting for Elite to drop in terms of the alpha, the little frontier trade thing that you put together, that people just sat and played because they just wanted to trade goods, in a kind of reminiscent way from a 1990s computer game, which is just crazy. But there was 20 or 30 of us hanging out in a chat room doing that for weeks.
That was kind of cheeky in that it relied on people having a knowledge of like an existing kind of the existing frontier stock market trading. But I suppose in a way there was a design there in that I tried to completely mimic the UI and everything that went into that original game, so people were able to literally open the page and start trading straight away. I didn't actually have to provide any instructions. So that's just one of the things about making games, is you've always got to think about the user and how are they going to understand it. You can't just assume that because you wrote it and you understand it, then everyone else will. So there's two ways to do that. Either you mimic something that exists, an existing kind of language that people are used to, or you're going to have to explain it via tutorials or readmes, things like that.
Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking that we were talking about this comparison with something like Elite and perhaps other kinds of adventures. But if you've got a sort of open free world that you're exploring, the kind of writing that you do for it and then the other stuff that writing leads to is really important. The thing that occurs to me is that actually one of the things they've added to Elite a lot since its first release, because there was none of this in the original, they've added in a lot of this stuff like the abandoned generation ships, where you can go and hear the audio logs. You've got other things where you'll hear like bits of dialogue from ships, like you'll hear a ship say, oh, there's going to be some trouble over in wherever. And I think where the writing is good and where they've done stuff well is when that writing not only gives you an idea of the world, but actually prompts you to go somewhere else. I mean, we're not, a lot of people I think would like in Elite there to be sort of linear narratives that you can follow, but I don't necessarily think that's what Elite is. What I think it should do a lot more of is story hooks that when you witness them, give you the opportunity to go somewhere else and carry on with that. If I can give an example of a game which, for me, is that I've played recently, it's an absolute masterclass in games design and writing. It has absolutely zero linear narrative. Well, a little bit at the beginning, but that's the game Outer Wilds.
Yeah.
So I don't know if people have played Outer Wilds. It is a sort of space travel game. It's a space travel game with first-person elements, but it's set in a solar system which is very small and very self-contained. And the physics, this is not a physics space sim for people. I mean, I've experimented a little bit. Even outside of your ship, you can jump from one planet to another. It's not, that's not impossible. But the thing about the writing in Outer Wilds is that you start off on this, this initial opening bit where you're walking around as a person and you're talking to NPCs and you're getting an idea of the world and what you're meant to be doing. But then after that, you're exploring the planets in this solar system, and you are coming across like odd little bits of notes left behind or recorded conversations between people or little bits of evidence. And And what I think is fundamentally really clever about the game is, having played a lot of things like Zelda, where unlocks to progression are done via you picking up an object that now allows you to go to a new place. Outer Wilds is completely open. Like, there's no secrets. Like, there's nothing physically blocking you from going from one place to another. It's only your knowledge. It's only you knowing how to find those things, and all that's done through the writing. So it'll be like, I want to give like an example of something without spoiling the game too much. But I mean it. For example, there's this puzzle around this object that moves, and essentially you could solve that puzzle just by trying all the different iterations of it. I mean, it's not, there's not that many combinations. But actually, as soon as all you need is one little bit of writing that says this only works when these two things line up, and when these two things line up, the door will open. So you stand there and wait for it, because you know it's going to happen. Whereas if you just casually wandered into that environment, you wouldn't know how to. So I think, if anyone listening has not played Outer Wilds, it is one of the best games experience I've had in my life. And in terms of storytelling, it's one of those games that made me realize I couldn't have experienced, either intellectually or emotionally, I couldn't have experienced that story in any way other than a video game. It is an entirely video game based storytelling medium, and it's utterly inspiring that anybody could craft something like that. So yeah, unfortunately, it's, but the sad thing is, of course, once you've learned everything, you can't replay it, because once the knowledge is in your head, it's like a murder mystery game. You can't play it again. But yeah, absolutely, Outer Wilds, check it out. I mean, it's amazing.
Darren, your thoughts? How do you approach it?
Well, I'd like to pick up on something John said, because John was saying that he's not done any writing, but he's clearly got a game with a visual style, an iconography, names to everything. These things all tie into it. These are all narrative design, right? It's not just about the writing. You name the enemies, like Miserable Marvin, I think was the one that was on his screen. You choose a bright color palette. You choose cartoony graphics. You are communicating to the player with all of these elements. If it had been more realistic graphics with a more sort of dark gray and brown color palette and more serious names, then that would have given a different thematic sense. So whenever a game developers ask me to do some writing, I instantly start asking for all of the details. It's not just, I want some backstory for a boss or something here. So, what's the situation? What's the gameplay? What's the game experience the player's going to have? Get to know the whole thing and the whys and the whys. Keep asking why behind everything. So that's always been my experience. Don't just do a little simple writing job. Get to know the full player experience, the context it's in, and everything you're trying to layer into that, and how potentially making suggestions for the game design as well to change to fit in with the different narrative elements. Because there's no point in having a separate narrative and a separate game. Like Chris says, it's got to be a kind of a story you experience through the game, rather than a story on the side of the game.
Emily, what's your thoughts in this? Where's your approach? Where does it start?
Well, because I'm working primarily on the marketing side, so basically as a copywriter for a small studio, most of my expertise comes in the extra materials. So Darren, I'm really pleased that you said that about the fact that there's names and there's this and there's that, and like technically all of the UX has to be composed almost in a way that makes for a seamless experience. So every word that you use in game, even if it's just the word choice on a button, is important, because it feeds into this environment that the player is in. So when it comes to my job, what I do first off is you've got to know your target audience. You've got to speak on their level. All the words that you use have got to be on their level. You've got to research. Obviously, if we're being callous about this, you've got to research keywords. You've got to research what people are going to be searching when they want to find your game. You've got to be bearing all of this stuff in mind. And you've got to be able to pitch the copy. And one of the things that I find really sort of it's constant explanation process, because copy and writing are very different disciplines. And I'm constantly saying to people I work with, copy is mechanics. It's the mechanics of words. And you know, even knowing something like age range of the audience that you're pitching for, the average literacy level of people in the UK is 9 years old. Now, the Sun newspaper writes at a reading age of 8 because that's the most accessible reading age of anyone. And, you know, and that means shorter sentences, that means words of one syllable, that means being simple. And one of the quotes that I live by basically is, God, this is just too easy to read, said no one ever. You know, like it's always the easier it is to read, the better. And it's all of those mechanics that really, really feed into these things. And you have to know who you're pitching to. You have to know whether you're writing a press release, whether you're writing something that's to somebody behind the scenes, or if you're writing something for people who are going to see it, who are consumers, because sometimes you write a press release, but in this digital age, it's not just members of the press who are going to see it. A lot of digital platforms just copy and paste the press release and publish it to their site. So you've got to bear that in mind. Yes, you're selling it to the person who wants to publish it, but you're also providing them with a piece of editorial that they're just going to stick straight on their site. And if they have to do too much work, they're just not going to do it. They won't promote your game. So, you know, you have to bear all of this in mind. And so, you know, a lot of my stuff is on that side, but then I also write in game. And I work with the production teams in terms of like what words to use and when and exactly all of those things. And one of the things that I find quite interesting is that sometimes there will be a mechanic where it's really complicated and they come to me and they say, Emily, can you just write a line of copy that's going to explain how to do this thing? And I'm like, well, can you explain to me how you do this thing? And they explain, and it takes 20 minutes of explanation. And I'm like, well, how can I put that into one word? Oh, work your magic. I'm like, look, I'm a wizard, but I'm not that much of a wizard, right? We're going to have to deal with this situation here. And sometimes obviously I end up just trying my best, but there is a certain amount of, pushback and saying, look, this is just too complicated. We're going to have to think this over again because people don't want to read. I could write a whole tutorial for them, but they won't read it. They're in a game. They want to just get on with it, you know? Yeah.
There is a LARP field analogy here that I can kind of bring to this, and I'll relate it to a games industry comparison as well. But the LARP field analogy is, or at least is, I'm telling somebody else's story, and she'll tell me off later if I get it wrong. The difference between a zombie and an abyssal zombie when you're in the makeup room and you're being asked to make zombies. So, okay, I know how to do makeup for a zombie, but what's an abyssal zombie? Well, it's this, and they've been sucked into this particular undead realm and they this, that, and the other. So more black or more white or a little bit of green? Well, which color would you like? I can add some face paint like this, or I can, or we can, yeah. So yeah, so no, knowing your audience and knowing the medium that you're working in. With Phoenix Point, we had quite a lot of that, frankly, in that, I think sometimes companies aren't necessarily aware of how far the sort of tone of narrative stretches into the game. And picking up Darren's point, the fact that everything is reflective of the narrative experience that a player is going to take, and whether they like that, whether they're sort of a puzzle-based gamer who avoids what they consider to be story or not, it's all part of the tone and the flavor. So things like the research trees, when we were writing the research trees, we had to make sure the research tree tone, the way in which it was written, the word choices that we used, they had to fit in with everything else. And it can be quite tricky because, there are sometimes some games companies don't necessarily realize that the writer, the writer is setting a tone. They kind of go, that's brilliant, great, and they kind of accept that, and that's fine. And then they go, well, should we run everything past them? And then you're like, this is quite a lot. You're asking me to rewrite this and rewrite this and rewrite this and rewrite, so actually it then becomes about trying to communicate that tone in an effective way in a short document that allows everybody to kind of pick up on it. And a lot of the time, and certainly this is my experience, some of the companies I've worked with are English is not their first language, so of course then setting that tone becomes difficult, and you need intermediaries. We had a fantastic situation where we had one sort of mid-management developer when we were working on one particular beta, who basically took a brief and went round the office and explained it to every person who was involved in coding that level, and just went, right, this is the document. If there's anything in this that you don't, here are the highlighted bits that I've found that are related to you designing this particular environment, or you designing this particular character, or you doing this uniform. Is there anything there you don't understand? And he went through all of it, with them, so that they could kind of reflect it. And that's laborious, that's hard. And if you don't, spend that kind of time, it can be sometimes a little confusing, in terms of what people do. But yeah, I think writing's everything. I think, John's downplaying himself a little bit, Darren. I think, the fact that he's not considering himself a writer, he's already doing it, really, in terms of what's there, and making those choices.
Yeah, I apologize for my imposter syndrome.
No, well, it happens to all of us, and I think we'll all be found out at different points, I'm sure, along the way. So this one's a funny one. This is a kind of a step out into the road question, and I think I'm waiting to see who decides to press the ejector seat first on this. So discussion point 3, are there any ubiquitous rules or guides on writing for or about games?
I can talk about that. I mean,
yeah.
Emily's talked before about keep it simple, and it's really important. Not just simple, but snappy. People playing games don't want a distraction. And the other thing is keep it optional, because unless you're specifically writing a narrative game, and that's the whole point, right? If you're making a text adventure, don't keep it too short, right? But for a lot of players, they're not that interested in the story. And the really big one where I see a lot of problems arise is where the flavor text obscures the gameplay information.
Yeah.
So a big
thing is real estate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Screen is real estate.
So one thing that I do in a lot of my games is where there's like they're typically RPGs, and you've got like a hover over thing over items or monsters or whatever else, and there's bits of text there, and there's one bit of text which is the gameplay information, and it's like really sharp. This is just the gameplay information, and there's another bit of text which is here's a bit of backstory, right? And they're different colors, and it's really obvious. This is what you need to play the game. This is just for flavor. And there's other games that do it very well. I'm thinking Fallen London, for instance. Whenever you see one of the text cards in it, it puts in bold the really important bits for the gameplay, and the rest of it, is just flavor. So just highlighting, making sure the player's aware this is the flavor and this is the thing, without making it too artificial and without ruining the experience. But don't let the writing get in the way of the game.
Okay. Any other universal rules or ubiquitous tips that people can think of?
I can pipe up here. I mean, one of the things that I've learned, and I think this applies to all kinds of writing, really, not just gaming, not just audio, but I think sometimes there's a tendency as a writer to feel that you've got to put across like absolutely everything to your audience or your player or whatever. And I think actually sometimes there's a discipline with yourself of saying, sometimes you're trying to put too much across. I mean, this is really following on from what Darren's saying, but the way I apply that is to say, well, actually, does it matter if they know what color the car is? This is very much an audio point. And I've mentioned before, this joke about the script that used to do the rounds at BBC Drama, that was called "The Gun in My Left Hand is Loaded," which is really about over narrating audio drama and too much exposition. But you come to a point where you realise actually there's certain bits of information that it doesn't matter if your audience interprets it in a slightly different way. So I think that's the tricky thing as a writer, particularly for games, is you don't want, there are going to be certain things that because you have a vision of what this thing is in your head, you're like, well, I've got to communicate all of this, and actually you don't. If the audience goes away with a slightly different idea in their head of what something looks like, or some other thing, that's, in a sense, that's great, because they're creating their own space within the narrative. And sometimes I think over prescribing what things, the way things should be imagined, actually takes something away from the player. So that's the thing I'd say, is don't get hung up on being too prescriptive about every little detail you've got in your head.
Good advice.
I can carry on from that, because I'm actually, even though I'm a writer and I write novels, in games, as soon as any amount of text comes up, I don't want to read it. Like I literally am that person that's just like, no, get it out of my way. I just want to play. And actually that's kind of good, I guess, because it means I know myself. And then I'm like, well, if I'm the worst of the worst for that, I know that people don't like reading it. Sometimes, sometimes writers are like, oh no, you have to read all the words. They're not going to. They're really not. And that's quite good in terms of copy. And obviously, at my game company, we write games for mobile as well. And that means that screen real estate is even more limited. There is no side of the screen where you can have blocks of text. There's just no room for it, and people wouldn't be able to see it anyway. So yeah, keeping copy absolutely to a minimum. But also, the things like the journals and things that you can read, yes, have that stuff if people want to dive into it. But I would say that that's a secondary. And if you're up against it on a deadline or something, that is definitely something that can be added in later. It's not the essentials are the limited copy that helps people to play the game. The extra stuff, I would say, is very much a nice to have, as we would say it at, where I work. It's nice to haves. And yeah, from what you should do, universal rules, one of the things that I find really useful is, it's a classic copywriting thing, but write a key message at the very beginning and the outset of the project. And that key message is like your elevator pitch. It's what's going to form the basis of your store descriptions. It's going to encapsulate key phrases that you're going to use to describe certain parts of the game. And the best and most efficient thing you can do is write a key message early and get it signed off at the highest level, and then work from there. And obviously that can go to pot, because I've worked on projects before where 2 weeks before launch, it's been decided that we're pitching at a completely different audience 2 weeks before launch. And then we've got to completely rewrite the game. And, and that can be horrendous. But at the same time, if you keep to that, like, okay, fine, we're rewriting it, rewrite the key message, get that signed off again. Everything else, reinterpretation of that, you're sorted. So yeah, like key message is about a paragraph. I'm holding this up. This means nothing. This is like 12 space Arial on A4 on a screen. Okay, that much copy.
on this screen, it's about 40-point font, but it's only because I've maxed up my my window. But I'm sure that's fine. John, yeah. Any ubiquitous kind of advice or rules that you've encountered when you've put together games?
Consistency of communication. For instance, tooltips. And I'll use Spinduel as the example on this. You've got spells and you've got items, and when people click on them, it gives them information. So it helps that you know what information you want to give them, and as other people have said, you want to keep it short and to the point. But you also in terms of formatting and in what order that information is given to the player, it's consistent, so that when they open up a tooltip, they can look at it and they know straight away which numbers they care about. They don't necessarily have to process all of the words. They could just look at it and get the information they want from it.
So I'm gonna throw something in here. I kind of anticipated that that somebody would press the ejector seat button and say, "There's no ubiquitous rules. You know, it's all depends on the context." And you all didn't, which was great. Because that's much more meaningful as a set of advice and answers from our experiences. Yeah, I'm going to throw something in that kind of takes this a little bit. It takes a slightly different approach, a little bit of academia into this, and I'm going to try and keep it not too non-applicable. I'm going to try and make sure it fits in with what we're discussing. So, just picking up some of the things that people have said, we've talked a bit about gameplay behavior here and what people want to do. They want to be involved. They want to be playing. And if we turn the screen into too much text, if we turn the screen into too much red information, what we're essentially doing is we're drawing them out of that interactive experience and we're drawing them into a passive experience, which is kind of, and I've made a crit of this before, the game style of some games that decide to reward you for being incredibly interactive and completing something with passivity. It kind of feels a bit weird, that they do that. But of course, if you're into the story, then obviously you want to see what the next thing is. And there is a kind of cultural ritual associated with passively watching some things, in terms of what's there. If you get a cutscene or something else, it's kind of emulating a cinema experience or something else. But there's a guy called Arseth, Espen J. Arseth, who wrote Cybertexts, and he writes about this thing called a Gothic text, which is this text that requires more than trivial effort to understand. So puzzle writing, writing things that are coded, writing things that require you to put a mirror up against the screen to read it, or having it in some sort of way you've got to solve it, and so on and so forth. And his assertion is that if you make your reader have to do some work, then actually they value what they read, a little bit more in terms of what's there, whatever the purpose of it is. I think they might feel a bit cheated if, as we've kind of said, the thing that you learned to read was not then relevant to the story, or it didn't have some kind of pivotal plot element to it in terms of what you were doing. But I do think it's interesting to think about the way in which we can change the behavior of the player, or use the player's instinct towards wanting to be active in terms of acquiring knowledge of the game. And we can maybe use that to our advantage in terms of what's there. So puzzles, and finding ways to write things that are embedded in the puzzles that can then, come back later. All right, and I think this kind of brings us nicely on to point 4. What are some of the most innovative and influential things you've seen or experienced in games? I'm going to start with Chris, if that's okay. I'll drop over to Chris, because that means he's got to come up with a different example from the one he had before.
I know you need to spend longer coming back to me. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of given the best example, really. Yeah, come back to me, because I've got to think, because
right.
Outer Wilds is clearly the best example of that, but I'll think of something else.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start then. I'll give one. Legacy for me. I think Legacy as an innovation in board games has been fabulous. And the specific example here I'm thinking of is Betrayal, which I love as a game. Betrayal at the House on the Hill is a game that was incredibly, the board game is incredibly influential on things that I was doing, because I loved the way in which it attempted to create a flip and a random scenario. But the legacy mechanic of it, allowing you to then continually replay the game with new characters who would find their grandfather's old items, creates another resonance to the game. So if you've not played Betrayal Legacy has this ability of you going back to the haunted house over generations and generations of characters, and in the different instances when you find items, you get the chance to name them. You write on the cards as to what the item is. And then, of course, if that item re-emerges in the next playthrough, you have your grandfather's Bible or your grandmother's sword or your great uncle's revolver, and so on and so forth. And it creates just this completely different set of mechanics, which kind of makes you think that you're part of this incredible story experience that is spanning more than one generation and more than one play. All right. Chris is going to take some time. Anybody want to take a stab of most influential or resonant experiences in games?
I can jump in here actually, because I've got like 3 points that I want to hit with it. So going back in time with the original games, like the arcades and the 8-bit era, you had platformers and things, and not a lot of thought went into story. It usually felt tacked on. And then you had things where somebody, through good decisions, good writing, would create a world where there might not necessarily be a story, but it made people think and develop their own story. And obviously, we're always going to go back to Elite on that one. But then there was the kind of move to actually trying to tell stories properly. I mean, we always joke about how players love jumping cutscenes. But there are actually games out there where the story was so good that people didn't jump the cutscenes. They were actually moved by the story. Thinking of things like The Last of Us. There was also a kind of in the middle, where there was a story, but there was world building. I'm thinking of Grim Fandango, where people just got completely sucked into that. Mass Effect as well. People got emotionally invested. But I think recently, for me, something that kind of changed the way people think about it was Her Story. Okay. I don't know if you've played that, where player decisions kind of dictate how you explore the game itself and how you discover it. I mean, in a sense, the game is linear because there's a set amount of content and there is a kind of story underlying there. But it's not a story you kind of experience in a linear fashion. You experience it as you understand it and search for more information. Then you get that information given to you and it starts making more sense. So, I think in a world where people are now getting heavily into binge watching stuff on Netflix, people are really keen on story, and games are finally catching up with that. Because it used to be a joke that games were terrible at telling story.
Okay, Chris says he's ready, but I'm gonna be nefarious and ask Darren and Emily if they want to jump in before.
I can go.
Go.
Okay, so I mean, I think one of the things about telling stories in games is that obviously you are playing this character. And you get a certain amount of control over what they do, but the control isn't yours and it's all programmed. And one of the moments that I experienced where this was really kind of cruel, what they did, was in Final Fantasy Crisis Core, where you're playing as Zack Fair. And at the end, I mean, this is not really a spoiler because in Final Fantasy VII, Zack Fair is dead. So this and you'd be playing Crisis Core afterwards, so you already know he has to die, but it gets up to this point, and basically it's really interesting. They could have made it a cutscene, but they didn't. They made you play it out, and it didn't matter how much you leveled up. It didn't matter how much you trained. You're going to lose at this point, and the people just keep coming. The attack just keeps coming until you die. And you are just there fighting, getting really desperate. And then you try and replay and you level up. But you've got to die at the end because obviously that's, you've already played 7, he doesn't make it. But there's this desperation when you've got to know this character and when you feel like you're not in control and they make you play it through, and they make you feel that lack of control in that moment. And it was so powerful. It was like, you know, properly emotional stuff. You're just like, no, he can't die, this is ridiculous. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do in that moment. It's programmed that way, and you, at some point, you've got to just face that and let it happen. And yeah, that moment of the sort of interplay between player and really mean, like that was it felt mean, it felt vindictive at the time. And yeah,
at least it was, you know, it wasn't personal vindictiveness. Every player obviously had the same vindictiveness placed upon them, although it felt personal, you know, because obviously it was your experience. Darren, your thoughts?
On the back of that, it reminds me of in Final Fantasy VII, when you're playing Cloud, it forces you to do the evil Cloud things, to take the black materia to try and attack Aerith just before she gets killed by Sephiroth. The game doesn't cutscene those; it actually makes you play, and that so ties in with the loss of identity of Cloud himself within the game. So there's actually quite a lot of clever stuff in Final Fantasy VII. I think it gets a bad rap because it's such a popular game, but there's actually a lot of really good, intricate detail there. But the game that really impressed me recently would be The Return of the Obra Dinn, which is a little bit like Her Story in that it's a narrative exploration game. You're exploring a non-linear story. You find a ship that is abandoned, but there's various corpses on it, and you have a special tool to let you see the moment of their death and to investigate what happened. And there's almost no text in the game, should be said, but there's a lot of story there. And I suppose you do get the transcription of the dialogue. But so much of it is you just looking at the pose of someone, where they're positioned in relation to someone else. Is that person wearing a wedding ring or not? There's all this kind of you paying attention to the interrelation of the characters and the events. So it's not just here's a story, it's you have to engage completely 100% with the story. So tying in a little bit, Alan, with what you're saying about the academic term that I've completely forgotten.
Gothic literature.
So I'm going to call that Megothic game, because you feel good at the end because you've invested so much time exploring in detail through the gameplay all of the different details of the story. I really love that game. It's very good.
All right, Chris,
thank you.
Let's put you out of your misery.
Yeah, I mean, I can second what John Stabler was saying, in the sense of, you know, that Her Story is, I mean, really the same sort of thing that I've been talking about that I was talking about with Outer Wilds. This idea that the game isn't solved mechanically; it's solved, you know, the point in the game where it says, "Have you seen enough? Do you understand?" And you can either carry on exploring, or you can, you know, there's no like you've won. It's now you understand what the story is. No, but the thing I was thinking of myself was, I'm not going to, you know, pick on a specific title that does this, having already, you know, expounded about Outer Wilds. I mean, I would say, but the most innovative thing for me in terms of writing and gameplay is when games have started to address failure not as a game over, but as this story is going to carry on regardless of how well you've done. Like maybe you succeeded, maybe you failed, but you carry on from this point. And for me, that's such a big change to how I play games.
Yeah.
You know, when that first came up, because it's I think the thing that probably did it for me one of the first times was maybe Alpha Protocol, which is a game that's very hard to get, because it turns out if you lose the music license for a game you've developed, you can no longer sell it. So unfortunately, the only place you can get it is if you find old copies on the PS3. But that's a game that very much you're going to play the game all the way to the end, sort of regardless of which path you take. And you can still die. I mean, you can physically lose all your health, but there are no gameplay choices that lead to game over. You know, you live with the decisions you make, and quite often, you know, those are binary decisions. But I find that fascinating, and I find it fascinating from a writing point of view as well, because you have to, you know, in the worst case scenario, if you're trying to go along with players' choices, you can end up with that tree that branches forever. You know, it's like the whole thing with, if you've ever sat down, I'm sure you have, Alan, but I mean, if anyone's ever sat down and tried to write like a choose your own adventure type thing, it's very easy to end up in a situation where every story decision splits your gameplay in two directions. And actually, the skill of doing that is about working out which elements can bring you back to the main thread and which ones take you off in a tangent, so that it doesn't become completely unmanageable. But I think, for me, that's the huge thing.
Yeah, failure narratives definitely is a big thing that we'd like to see more of in terms of what's there. Okay, all right, we're pretty much out of time. I know that Kevin Elliott is due in next for his talk this afternoon. I'd like to thank my guests. You guys are fantastic. That was a great hour. I'm sure there's plenty there that we've all learned. Frankly, I learned a load from everything that everybody was said, and I'm sure everybody has felt the same in terms of what's there. So in the delightfully awkward way in which Zoom works, give yourself a round of applause. You were fantastic in terms of what you've done, and hopefully we can pick this up more on Lave Radio in the coming episodes in terms of what we're